drinking 4 liters of beer every single day, sleeping 10 people to one bed, sharing the living room with a cow, an ox, and a dozen chickens, slaughtering a pig every November and rationing the salted meat across 150 freezing days. These are the things ordinary people in medieval Europe did to survive winter. Not the rich, not the nobility, the peasants. The 90% of the population that history mostly forgot to write down. For roughly 500 years between 1300 and 1850, Northern Europe lived through what climatologists now call the Little Ice Age. Winters dropped to 20 below 0 Celsius in the coldest decades. The Thames froze solid enough to hold markets on the ice. The Baltic froze. Whole vineyards in England, planted during the warmer centuries before, died and were never replanted. And the peasants who lived through it did so without central heating, without insulated glass, without thermal fabrics, without antibiotics, for the pneumonia that came after the cold. They should have died. Most of them did not. This is how they did it. An 8-part survival system, engineered across roughly 300 years of trial and error, tightly integrated, ruthlessly efficient, and calibrated exactly to a climate they could not control. And at the end of this video, we are going to look at the one winter that finally broke it. The winter that killed between 5 and 7 million people in 30 months, and set up the Black Death that followed a generation later. The system starts on the peasant's back, because the outermost layer of the survival system was the one closest to the skin. Before we get to houses and fires, we have to talk about what the peasant wore. A working peasant in a northern French village around the year 1350 wore, in winter, an average of 4 to 6 layers of garment, undertunic in linen or hemp, overtunic in coarse wool, a woolen hood called a coif that covered the head, neck, and shoulders, a hooded outer cape called a chaperon, or, in England, a hood, woolen hose on the legs, gartered at the knee, woolen wraps around the feet inside leather turn shoes. Every layer was doing a specific thermodynamic job. The linen underlayer wicked sweat away from the skin, because a wet peasant in winter was a dead peasant. The wool layers trapped air. And air, not fabric, was the actual insulator. Wool has a physical property that no other pre-industrial fiber had. Each fiber is naturally crimped, and when you weave crimped fibers together and then full them, meaning you pound them in warm water until the fibers lock, you create a fabric that traps roughly 85% air by volume. Modern goose down traps around 90%. The medieval peasant was, essentially, wearing early generation goose down made from sheep. Producing that clothing took an extraordinary amount of labor. Historian Eleanor Carus Wilson, whose work at the London School of Economics in the 1940s and 50s effectively founded the modern study of medieval textile economics, estimated that a single woolen tunic represented roughly 500 to 800 hours of labor, from sheep to finished garment. Shearing, sorting, cleaning, carding, spinning, weaving, fulling, dyeing, sewing. For a family of 5, that is thousands of hours of labor per year just to keep bodies covered, which is why the Cistercian monastic order became so economically dominant in the 12th and 13th centuries. The Cistercians industrialized wool production at scale, running sheep operations of 10,000 animals across northern England and Yorkshire, and they effectively became the textile bank of medieval Europe. The mirror is worth sitting with. The clothes you are wearing right now, if they came from a factory, represent about 6 hours of aggregate human labor. The medieval peasant's winter coat represented 600. When you read that peasants only owned 2 or 3 sets of clothing in their entire life, that is not a story about poverty. That is a story about how expensive it was to stay warm before machines. If you had to hand produce every thread you wore this winter, what would you keep, and what would you let freeze? The clothing kept them alive when they were outside, but most of a medieval winter was not spent outside. It was spent inside. Sleeping, working, waiting for spring. And the sleeping is where the second layer of the system engages. In the average peasant household in Northern Europe between 1200 and 1500, everyone slept in the same room, frequently in the same bed. Parents, children, sometimes grandparents, sometimes servants or apprentices, sometimes visiting travelers. 6 to 10 bodies pressed together under shared blankets. To modern sensibilities, this reads as poverty. To a medieval physicist, if such a person had existed, it would have read as thermal engineering. A resting human body produces around 80 to 100 watts of heat continuously. That is the equivalent, in modern terms, of a small incandescent light bulb burning inside the skin. Put 8 bodies in an enclosed space and you have generated 640 to 800 watts of heat. A modern space heater on its low setting produces about 750. The medieval bed, in other words, was a space heater made of people. Historian Barbara Hunnewalt, in her landmark 1986 study The Ties That Bound, mapped this out in coroners, records from 14th century England. She found that the majority of winter deaths in peasant households were not people who froze in their beds. They were people who had left the bed to relieve themselves in the yard, to check on livestock, to walk to a neighbor's house, and been caught by exposure. The bed itself was the safest place in the winter landscape. It was warmer, in aggregate, than any single fire in the house. There is a darker layer to this too. Disease traveled through communal beds at catastrophic rates. When the Black Death reached a peasant household in 1348, it did not kill one person at a time. It killed the bed. Whole family units were found dead together, in the same posture they had gone to sleep in. The system that kept them warm through winter was also the system that killed them in a summer plague. The margin between survival and mass extinction was, quite literally, a shared blanket. If you had to share a bed with your entire extended family every winter for the rest of your life to stay warm, could you do it? Or would you rather freeze in your own room? Tell me in the comments. Because the medieval answer to that question was not a choice. It was a survival requirement. And that blanket sat on top of a piece of furniture that was itself an engineered survival object. When modern people imagine a medieval bed, they imagine a rough wooden platform with straw on it. That is close, but it misses the engineering entirely. The typical peasant bed in Northern Europe between 1300 and 1600 was a wooden frame roughly 2 meters by 1.5 meters, raised off the earthen floor by about 30 centimeters. That elevation was not a design choice, it was a survival choice. The floor of a medieval peasant house was almost always packed earth, and packed earth in winter stayed within a few degrees of the outside temperature. Sleeping on the floor was, in caloric terms, sleeping in a walk-in freezer. The elevation cost the family the labor of building a bed frame. It bought them a temperature differential of 10 to 15 degrees Celsius between them and the ground. The bed itself was layered. A woven rope or leather webbing formed the base. On top of that, a mattress called a paillasse, stuffed with straw, chaff, or dried bracken. On top of that, a second mattress stuffed with feathers or wool, if the household could afford it. On top of that, linen sheets. On top of that, woolen blankets. On top of that, a fur or heavy woolen coverlet. In wealthier peasant households, and this is the part most modern people do not know, the entire bed was enclosed in heavy curtains that hung from a wooden frame or from hooks in the ceiling. The curtains closed at night. Once closed, they trapped the body heat of the sleepers inside a fabric envelope of about 3 cubic meters. 3 cubic meters of enclosed air, heated by 8 human bodies, would reach and hold a temperature of around 18 to 22 degrees Celsius, even when the room outside the curtains was near freezing. Archaeologists have reconstructed these bed enclosures at experimental sites in Denmark and reproduced these exact temperature curves. The medieval peasant, once inside the curtains, was sleeping in what was effectively a low-tech tent, insulated by fabric on all 6 sides, heated by human metabolism. Here is the detail that changes the math. The paillasse itself, the straw mattress, was replaced every autumn. Old straw was burned or composted. Fresh straw was cut, dried, and stuffed in during October or November, right before the cold set in. Used straw compresses over time and loses its insulating air pockets. Fresh straw held roughly 40% more trapped air by volume than year-old straw. The annual restuffing was a survival ritual disguised as housekeeping. What is truly haunting about the medieval bed is what happens when you take it apart in the archaeological record. In villages abandoned during the Little Ice Age crisis, archaeologists find the bed frames still standing, the mattresses long since decomposed, the families gone. Whole villages in Yorkshire, in the Alps, in Norway, where the bed was the last thing left when the people were not. The infrastructure of warmth outlasting the people it was built to warm. The bed did not stand alone, though. It stood in a room that had a fire. And the fire, too, was engineered. If you had to name the single technology that defined the medieval peasant winter, you would probably say fire. And you would be almost right. But the medieval peasant did not simply have fire. They had a management system so tightly regulated that a specific law was passed in England in 1068 to enforce it. The law was called the couvre-feu. In modern English, curfew. The word literally meant cover the fire. William the Conqueror imposed it across England after the Norman conquest, requiring every household to bank down their hearth fire at a specific evening hour, marked by the ringing of a bell. Similar laws existed across France, the Low Countries, and Germany throughout the medieval period. The law was not primarily about crime prevention, it was about fire prevention. Medieval peasant houses were made of wood, wattle, daub, and thatch. A single unbanked fire in a windy November night could burn down an entire village. And when your village burned in November, you did not rebuild before spring, you died. The deeper reason for the fire regulation was economic. Fuel was expensive. In heavily forested regions of Scandinavia and Germany, wood was accessible, but still labor-intensive to gather. In deforested regions of England, France, and the Low Countries by the 14th century, wood had become one of the largest household expenses. Historian John Langdon at the University of Alberta, whose research on medieval fuel economies was published across the 1990s and 2000s, calculated that the average peasant household spent between 20 and 30% of its total annual labor on fuel gathering, storage, and processing. The management of that fuel was ruthless. A single central hearth burned in the main room of the house. It was never allowed to go out from October through April. Not because keeping it lit was easier than relighting it, although that was true, but because the coals banked overnight became the ignition source for the next morning's fire. Losing the fire meant walking to a neighbor's house at dawn to borrow a live coal. In some villages, one specific household kept a designated fire that other households drew from. That household was, in effect, running a public utility 600 years before public utilities existed. The heat output of the medieval hearth was smaller than you would think. A well-managed peasant fire produced about 2 to 3 kilowatts of heat continuously. A modern electric space heater produces up to 1,500 watts on high. So the medieval hearth was roughly the equivalent of running 2 modern space heaters 24 hours a day from October to April. Except that most of the heat went up the chimney or through the roof. The actual useful heat delivered to the room was closer to 700 or 800 watts, enough to keep the air near the hearth around 10 to 15 degrees Celsius, while the corners of the room stayed near freezing. This is the detail that changes how you think about medieval life. The room was not uniformly warm. It had a hot zone near the fire and a cold zone against the walls. Furniture, activity, sleeping arrangements, even social hierarchy inside the house were organized around the temperature gradient. The head of the household sat closest to the fire. Children and servants sat further out. Elders, who felt cold most keenly, were given priority near the hearth. The room itself was a thermal ladder. If your family had to sit in an assigned position based on age and status because only one spot in your entire house was actually warm, who would get the best seat? Who would get the coldest corner? Tell me who sits where in your household version of this arrangement, because in medieval Europe those seats were assigned for life. By the 14th century, though, wood was running out, and the medieval peasant, faced with fuel scarcity, made a decision that no modern homeowner would consider. They moved the livestock indoors. Not into a shed attached to the house. Into the house. Across large parts of medieval northern Europe, Norway, northern Germany, Ireland, Wales, northern England, parts of France, the standard peasant dwelling from roughly the 9th century through the 15th was a building type called a longhouse. A rectangular structure, typically 15 to 30 meters long, divided by an internal wall or a low partition. On one side of the partition, the family lived. On the other side, the animals. To modern readers, this sounds unsanitary, and it was. It also sounds inefficient, and it absolutely was not. A single cow at rest produces around 900 to 100 watts of body heat continuously. A working ox produces around 500. A sheep produces about 100 to 150. A pig, around 200. A peasant longhouse in winter might contain 2 cows, an ox, 4 sheep, 3 pigs, and a dozen chickens. That is a heat output at the low end of around 4 kilowatts, continuously, all night, all winter, without any fuel input beyond the hay and straw already stored for the animals as food. The internal partition wall between the animals and the humans was typically wattle, daub, or wooden planks, and it was deliberately not sealed. Heat flowed from the byre, the animal side, into the living space. Archaeological reconstructions in Denmark, particularly the work of the Center for Historical Building Research at the National Museum, have measured the temperature differential in reconstructed longhouses at around 6 to 8 degrees Celsius between the human side and the outside air, generated almost entirely by animal body heat when the fire was banked overnight. The animals were, in essence, a distributed heating system that also produced milk, wool, meat, leather, and manure. The manure was collected daily and used to fertilize the fields that grew the food that fed the animals that produced the manure. The system was closed loop, energy positive, and it did not require a single external input of fuel. It was, on any honest accounting, the most efficient heating system that has ever existed in Europe. The real question is what happened behind closed doors when this system failed. When a village lost its livestock to disease, to raiding, to famine that forced the family to slaughter the animals for food, it did not just lose meat and milk. It lost its heating. Historian Bruce Campbell has traced this failure cascade in the records of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317, which we will return to at the end of this video. When peasants slaughtered their animals in the winter of 1315 because they were starving, they did not know they were also slaughtering their heating system. The following winter, without the animals, the longhouses were 7 degrees colder. Mortality tripled. Losing the animals was, in caloric terms, losing the fire. Which brings us to the food itself. Modern nutrition science treats saturated fat as something to minimize. Medieval peasant nutrition treated it as something to hoard. The reason is not cultural, it is thermodynamic. A human body maintaining itself at 37 degrees Celsius in a house at 5 degrees Celsius burns roughly 3,500 to 4,500 calories per day just to hold its core temperature and perform basic activity. That is the caloric equivalent of a modern athlete's training day, performed by an average adult every single day from November through March. Now multiply that by every member of a household. A family of 6 was burning something in the region of 22,000 to 27,000 calories per day just to not die of cold. Sourcing that many calories from grains alone would have required an unfeasible volume of bread, so the medieval winter diet became fat-forward and calorie-dense. The staples were pottage, salt pork, salt fish, hard cheese, butter, and small beer. The pottage, a thick stew simmered continuously over the fire, absorbed fat, meat scraps, root vegetables, and grain into a single high-density meal that could be reheated and stretched across days. The salt pork, produced during the annual November slaughter, a date historians call Martinmas, marked by the feast of St. Martin on November 11th, was the primary protein source across the entire winter. Every peasant household with any livestock at all slaughtered a pig in November. The pig was salted, smoked, hung, and rationed across roughly 150 days. Historian Christopher Dyer of the University of Leicester, whose work Everyday Life in Medieval England, published in 1994, remains one of the definitive economic reconstructions of peasant nutrition, has calculated the average winter caloric intake of an English peasant at around 3,000 to 3,500 calories per day, which is, notably, still lower than what their bodies were burning. The medieval peasant was almost always in mild caloric deficit through the winter, losing between 2 and 5 kilograms of body weight between November and April. That weight was, essentially, a fuel reserve that the body burned to stay warm. The autumn feasts before Advent were not just religious. They were biological. Every peasant was fattening themselves before winter, the same way a bear fattens itself before hibernation. And then there was the beer. The average adult peasant in medieval England drank around 3 to 4 liters of beer per day. Not by choice, by requirement. This sounds like modern journalism inventing shock value. It is not. The primary documentation comes from monastic and manorial account books, which recorded beer rations issued to laborers with the same precision they recorded grain rations. In a 15th century Cistercian monastery in Kent, the daily beer allowance was set at 1 gallon per adult male worker, that is 3.78 liters. In some German breweries, the allowance reached 5 liters per day. The reason was not intoxication. The beer in question was called small beer, or, in French, petite bière. It was brewed to an alcohol content of around 1 to 2%, sometimes less. You could drink it all day and not become drunk. It was brewed from the second and third mashings of the barley. The strong ale was brewed from the first mash, sold for cash, or reserved for holidays. Small beer was the everyday beverage. It was safer than water because the brewing process boiled out pathogens. It was calorie-dense at around 150 to 200 calories per liter, and it contained enough alcohol to preserve itself for several days without refrigeration, in a world where refrigeration did not exist. Multiply the numbers. 4 liters of small beer at 175 calories per liter equals 700 calories per day per adult. That is roughly 1/5 of the winter caloric requirement, delivered as liquid, safely, cheaply, and with a mild warming sensation, because alcohol slightly dilates peripheral blood vessels and creates a subjective feeling of warmth even as it modestly accelerates heat loss. The medieval peasant was, essentially, sipping a low-alcohol thermal supplement all day, every day. Wine served a similar function in the wine-producing regions of France, Italy, and Spain, though in more moderate quantities. Mulled wine, wine heated with spices and honey, was the winter drink of choice in wealthier households. In the coldest regions of Scandinavia and Eastern Europe, distilled spirits arrived later in the medieval period and served the same function. Aqua vitae, water of life. The name is not accidental. The part no one wants to talk about is what this diet did to the body over decades. Chronic mild dehydration from constant beer consumption. Chronic mild caloric deficit. Chronic exposure to salt from preserved foods. Chronic cold stress. Medieval peasants aged fast. A 40-year-old peasant in the archaeological record presents to modern forensic anthropologists as a body under significant physiological stress. Osteoarthritis in the joints. Enamel hypoplasia in the teeth from winter malnutrition markers. Bone density loss from repeated calcium deficits. They survived the winters, but the winters did not leave them intact. The clothing kept them warm, the bed sealed the heat, the fire warmed the room, the animals warmed the house. The food fueled the body. But none of it would have worked if the walls themselves had leaked heat like a modern uninsulated building. The medieval peasant house looks, from the outside, like a fragile building. Timber frame, woven stick walls, a shaggy roof of straw or reeds. To a modern architect, trained on brick, concrete, and fiberglass insulation, it looks primitive. This is where the modern architect would be wrong. The standard peasant house across most of northern Europe, between 1000 and 1500, was built from a timber frame filled with a lattice of woven hazel or willow sticks, called wattle. That wattle was then coated on both sides with a plaster of clay, straw, dung, and lime. This is daub. The wall, once finished and cured, was roughly 15 to 20 centimeters thick. The roof was thatched, covered with tightly bundled straw, reed, or heather, laid at a steep pitch, typically 50 to 60 degrees, so that rain and snow would slide off before soaking through. Modern testing on reconstructed wattle and daub walls, particularly the ongoing research program at the Weald and Downland Museum in West Sussex, has measured the thermal resistance, the R value, of a properly finished wattle and daub wall at around R4 to R6. For comparison, a modern uninsulated brick cavity wall has an R value of around R2 to R3. A modern well-insulated cavity wall runs R15 to R20. So the medieval wall was about twice as good as a modern uninsulated wall, and about a third as good as a modern well-insulated one. Thatch is where the numbers get remarkable. A thatched roof of 30 centimeters of packed reed or straw has an R value of around R25 to R30. That is better than most modern residential roof insulation. The medieval peasant was living under a roof that outperformed the roof over most modern people's heads. The thatch trapped air the same way wool trapped air, through hundreds of thousands of tiny voids between the fibers. It shed water because of its steep pitch. It resisted rot because the smoke from the constant hearth fire penetrated it, deposited a layer of tar, and killed the fungi and insects that would otherwise have destroyed it. The windows, or the lack of them, complete the picture. Peasant houses had almost no windows. Where windows existed, they were small, high, and closed with wooden shutters in winter. Glass was too expensive. Oiled parchment was sometimes used as a translucent covering. Most rooms were lit by the fire and by the low light coming through a smoke hole in the roof. To a modern person, this sounds miserable. To a medieval physicist, it was smart. Every window is a hole in the thermal envelope of a building. Fewer windows meant less heat loss. The floor was packed earth, or, in wealthier houses, wooden planks laid over earth. Earth is a poor conductor of heat, which means it does not steal heat from a room quickly. It also has thermal mass, meaning it absorbs heat during the day and releases it slowly at night. The medieval floor, unglamorous as it looks, was a passive heat storage system. The whole building was, in effect, a low-tech thermal fortress. Small volume, thick walls, high-R roof, almost no windows, packed thermal mass floor, continuous internal heat sources. When you stack the medieval house against a modern uninsulated apartment on any measure of thermal efficiency per calorie of fuel input, the medieval house wins. And it does so on materials that were free, local, and biodegradable. The house was smart, but the house was not, in the end, enough. Because the technology that finally tipped the medieval survival system into stability was not physical, it was social. Everything so far has been about physical mechanisms: clothing, beds, fires, animals, food, walls. But the medieval peasant did not survive winter alone in a well-insulated house. The medieval peasant survived winter in a village, and the village, in winter, physically collapsed inward on itself. Across most of Europe, between 1200 and 1500, winter meant the near-total suspension of outdoor agricultural work. The fields were frozen. The animals were confined. Travel between villages was dangerous. And so a peculiar thing happened. The village went indoors, and it went indoors together. Communal winter labor took several forms. In England, the practice was called winter watching, later spinning bees. In France, the veille. In Germany, the Spinnstube. In Scandinavia, the Kvoldvaka. The name varied. The function did not. Groups of villagers, usually organized by gender and age, gathered in one house through the long winter evenings to work together at repetitive tasks. Spinning wool, weaving, sewing, repairing tools, making rope, grinding grain, preparing preserves. The economic logic was simple. One fire lit one room and warmed one group of workers. If 10 women spun wool separately in 10 different houses, that was 10 fires, 10 fuel loads, 10 kilowatts of continuous heat output. If those same 10 women spun wool together in one house, that was 1 fire, 1 fuel load, and 1/3 the total heat output for the same aggregate work completed. The village collectively saved a staggering amount of fuel by concentrating winter labor into shared spaces. The deeper function was social. Historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie, in his 1975 book Montaillou, reconstructed the life of a single Occitan village in the early 14th century from Inquisition records, and he showed that the winter veille was where information moved. Stories were told, marriages were arranged, feuds were mediated, skills were passed down. The children learned by watching. The elderly stayed relevant by teaching. The village recohered every winter into a single organism, sharing heat, food, labor, and knowledge in ways that were not possible during the productive months of the year. There is a phrase Ladurie uses that has stayed with historians ever since. He called the veille the winter forge of the medieval community. It was where the community was, quite literally, made and remade each year against the pressure of the cold. The timeline stops making comfortable sense when you consider what happened to villages that could not or would not maintain their communal structures. Isolated households, individual peasants living alone, unmarried adults without kin. These people died at rates roughly 2 to 3 times higher than integrated households across every winter mortality dataset historians have reconstructed. The single peasant did not survive medieval winters. The village survived medieval winters. The single peasant was a statistical anomaly. In your neighborhood right now, if the power went out for the entire winter, Could you and the 10 households closest to you organize yourselves into one shared building and survive it together? Tell me honestly in the comments, because that answer is the actual difference between the medieval world and ours. The system held. For 500 years it held. Until one winter, it did not. In the spring of 1315, the weather across northern Europe turned wet and did not stop. Historian William Chester Jordan, in his 1996 book, The Great Famine, reconstructed the meteorological record from monastic chronicles across England, France, Germany, and the Low Countries. And the picture is bleak. It rained through May. It rained through June. It rained through July. Fields flooded. Grain rotted in the stalks. Hay could not be dried. Salt production, which required evaporating seawater in open pans, collapsed because the pans would not dry. Without salt, the November slaughter could not preserve meat for winter. Without hay, the animals could not be fed through the cold months. By October of 1315, the medieval peasant survival system was already breaking. The fields had produced perhaps 40% of a normal harvest. The animals were being slaughtered early because there was nothing to feed them. The remaining animals were being kept alive on whatever fodder could be scrounged. And then winter came. Winter 1315 to 1316 was cold. Not extraordinarily cold by Little Ice Age standards, but cold enough. And the survival system, already stressed, cascaded. Peasants who had eaten through their preserved food by January started slaughtering the remaining livestock. Slaughtering the livestock meant losing the longhouse heating. Losing the heating meant the internal temperature of the houses dropped by 6 to 8 degrees Celsius overnight. The cold houses meant respiratory disease. The respiratory disease meant weakened immune systems. The weakened immune systems, in bodies already in caloric deficit, meant that winter illnesses, which would normally have been survivable, became fatal. Spring 1316 came, and it rained again. The second failed harvest was worse than the first. By the winter of 1316 to 1317, entire villages in northern France, the Low Countries, and southern England were literally emptying. The chronicles record cases of cannibalism. The chronicles record parents abandoning children. The chronicles record the sale of children for food. The medieval peasant survival system, integrated across every level, from wool clothing to shared halls to preserved pork to communal beds, had assumed a baseline of at least a partially successful harvest every year. When 2 consecutive harvests failed, the system had no fallback. It just collapsed. The mortality is disputed, but the ranges are known. The best current estimates, aggregated by historian Bruce Campbell in The Great Transition, put deaths across northern Europe between 1315 and 1322 at somewhere between 10 and 15% of the total population. That is between 5 and 7 million people. In some regions of the Low Countries, mortality reached 25%. In some alpine communities, entire villages did not survive. The Great Famine ended in 1322 when the weather stabilized. But the medieval peasant system never fully recovered. The population, weakened, was primed for a second and much worse catastrophe. 26 years later, in 1348, the Black Death arrived. And the Black Death killed the survivors of the Great Famine and their children at rates that no modern population has ever experienced. Between 1/3 and 1/2 of everyone alive in Europe died in the plague years of 1348 to 1351. The two catastrophes are connected. Historian Bruce Campbell argues that the population was already immunologically and nutritionally weakened by the Great Famine, and that without the famine, the plague mortality would likely have been significantly lower. The medieval peasant survival system did not just fail in 1315. Its failure set the stage for a second failure a generation later that reshaped European civilization permanently. For 300 years, the system worked. It worked so well that peasants living in it could not imagine a winter it would not handle. The clothing, the bed, the fire, the animals, the food, the beer, the house, the shared hall, all integrated, all reinforcing each other. And then 2 wet summers happened. And the whole thing came apart. Here is what most people don't realize about this story. There is a piece of survival technology that predates the medieval peasant system by more than 1,000 years. A piece of technology so advanced that when archaeologists first uncovered it in the ruins of Roman Britain, They refused to believe it was as old as the carbon dating said. The Romans engineered heated floors in stone villas across the freezing frontiers of Britain and Germany, 2,000 years before central heating existed. The full breakdown of how they did it, and why the technology completely vanished for 1,000 years after Rome fell, is on screen right now. Click it before the algorithm buries it. Because the real question isn't how medieval peasants survived winter. The real question is why humanity forgot how to build heated floors and lived through 500 years of unnecessary cold before rediscovering what the Romans had already solved.